toward the One, the perfection of love, harmony, and beauty, the only being, united with all the illuminated souls who form the embodiment of the Master, the Spirit of Guidance. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, 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 Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Astaghfirullah, 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 astaghfirullah. Astaghfirullah, 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 astaghfirullah. Astaghfirullah, 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 astaghfirullah. La ilaha illallah. Illallah, illallah, la ilaha, la ilaha, illallah, illallah, la ilaha, la ilaha. Illallah, la ilaha, la ilaha, illallah, la ilaha, la ilaha, la ilaha, illallah, la ilaha, la ilaha, illallah, la ilaha, illallah, la ilaha, la ilaha, 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 la ilaha, illallah, 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 la ilaha illallah, la ilaha illallah, La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. La ilaha illallah. Illallah. La ilaha 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 illallah. Illallah. La ilaha 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 illallah. 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 Illallahu, 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 Allahu, 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 Allahu. Mm, 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 mm. يا نور يا عظيم Ya Nur Ya Alim, 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 Ya Nur Ya Alim. Ya Hakam Ya Alim, 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 Ya Hakam Ya Khabir, 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 Ya Hakam Ya Khabir. Inhale, think Hakam. Exhale, think Khabir. Or 11 breaths. Amin. So tonight I wanted to give some, what I'm going to call view teachings, the Sufi view of reality, at least insofar as I have any idea about that. Um, and some notes about how this path is in some ways fundamentally different from many other paths. And for better or for worse, these teachings on the view are scattered all through Inayat Khan's discourses to his students and his public discourses, which were recorded and transcribed into the books that we call the message volumes and assembled volumes on specific topics such as mastery or the unity of religious ideals, or all these different things, the nature of the mind. So there really, as far as I know, there isn't any one place that I could send somebody to give them a comprehensive picture of the Sufi path as it was given by Inayat Khan. And the little chunk of that I've managed to assimilate. But I thought it would be interesting and possibly useful to just do a riff. And so where I'll start with it is the notion that this is a path of non-duality and what that really means. And it's also a path of embodiment rather than transcendence and what that really means. insofar as I understand it. And to offer a definition of non-duality, it's inside of and at the basis of what we are affirming when we say La ilaha illallah or La ilaha illallahu. And those are actually subtly. And when we talk about, air quotes, non-duality, what we're saying is that there is fundamentally only one consciousness that not only pervades everything, but out of which everything both concretizes and ultimately returns to. And so from utter stillness, which is so still that the mind cannot understand it, because in order to understand things, the mind has to move. And so the mind inherently cannot understand cessation. And the ego totally hates the idea, because in order to encounter cessation, the ego has to not exist, at least in the way that we commonly experience it. And so in that encounter, there is this profound figure ground shift. So God, Allah, Hu, That, D-H-A-T, it's pronounced That or That, actually. So kind of a flat A in proper Arabic. Essence without an opposite. That one consciousness is all that exists in varying degrees of density and varying degrees of wakefulness or sleep. And in that encounter of the provisional oneself with essence, there is this figure ground shift where reality actually shows up as it is. And the thing that is so hard to understand, but is so simple, it's hard to understand. It's impossible to understand through the mind, because the mind and our thoughts are inherently dualistic, and language is also dualistic. So there's a good deal of distortion in this description that I'm giving. God, the one consciousness, divine essence without an opposite, is always subject, never object. So this experience that you have named myself is God's experience of being filtered and refracted through your nervous system and your history and all of who you think you are and what you think you're doing here. And filtered and constricted down into this little tiny, almost impossibly small aperture. Like we're all looking down the wrong end of the telescope at life. And the figure ground shift is when the one consciousness becomes foreground instead of the wallpaper. And the one consciousness apprehends itself through you as you without the filters. And so the fundamental identity behind, underneath, inside of who you take yourself to be is that one. And so when enlightenment or awakening strikes, it's not actually us that awakens or gets enlightened or any of those things. In a sense, we talk about it that way, but that's not how it works. God awakens in your location. And the myself or the you that thought it was borrowing God's experience becomes decentralized. There are moments which we call fana, where that provisional individuality becomes effaced. And those are profoundly powerful moments that will completely wreck your life. Because everything that doesn't support the deeper reality of who and what you are, all the contrivance has to go. It just becomes suddenly untenable, and you're left with, oh my God, I have been living this untruth. First time that happened to me, I trashed a career and a relationship in one stroke because my life was just kind of a wreck. And I had no idea how much contrivance and just self-absorption that I had been enmeshed in. And that all dropped away for just a moment. And it was as profoundly frightening afterwards as it was exalting in that moment. So when there's many levels of La ilaha illallah or La ilaha illallahu, and I'll get to how those are the same and how those are different in a second, if I remember. So each different Sufi order has a little bit different take on how this works and how closely committed they are to a more orthodoxly Muslim kind of perspective, inside of which the esoteric teachings are kind of encoded and then, delivered. The Naqshbandis, by and large, and there are exceptions, tend to be pretty orthodox in their manner of practice and in their articulation. And one might be led to believe, based on the languaging and the approach, that there's dualism. There really isn't, but they don't talk about the non-dual stuff. There are Naqshbandi Murshids who don't follow that route, but they tend to be more hidden. It's harder to find them. They don't talk about what they know publicly. And that tends to be true through much of the Sufi thing, regardless of the order. The Sufis in India tend to be a little more explicit about it, partly because many times they've got murids, students that belong to different religions, and so they just bypass all of the iconography and get down to the pure metaphysics. That may be an influence from yoga, I don't know. So there's the exoteric level of La ilaha illallah, means there is no God except Allah. And then the proviso is that Allah is just the name that, as you begin to move deeper into the more esoteric, through the mesoteric, shall we say, Allah being our name. And especially in India, or with some of the more universal sheikhs and the other orders elsewhere, Allah is just the name we have, but all the names are God's names. They may or may not tell you that there are almost 8 billion of God's names on the planet, because that's the only identity that actually exists, is that one consciousness experiencing the worlds of multiplicity through and as every sentient being, according to its capacity for awareness. There is no other source of awareness. The implication of that is also profound. That also means that all of the ignorance in the world and all of the hatefulness and all of the negativity is also taking place inside of Allah. It can't be otherwise. Now, in the dualistic paths or the dualistic interpretations of Islam, which tends to creep in around the edges sometimes in with Islamic Sufism, if you read or study Patanjali's yoga, there's a pretty well-defined dualism between matter and spirit, and profane and sacred, and impure and pure. And within the dualistic Brahmani kinds of yoga, they go to extreme lengths to maintain purity. And one has to say, there's also a great deal of class privilege that kind of underlies that whole structure. And the caste system and all of the stuff that that implies. And so with the Sufi path, at least as it's been transmitted to me, and from the little drop of Inayat Khan's transmission that I have and can say, yeah, I pretty much kind of understand this. There is no duality. Matter is the densest countenance of spirit. Spirit is the most exalted, shall we say, countenance of matter. And it's a continuum. And as he does, articulating this continuum in terms of different vibratory planes. So that essence, the absolute, is absolute purity and it's absolute stillness. So much so that we can't even think about it. It can't even be observed except by means of itself. And I'll come back to that. And so there have been different articulations given of why absolute stillness begins to move. And as it moves, it takes on direction, not north or south, but direction. And as that movement begins to speed up, it takes on density. The vibration, which starts as no vibration, becomes denser. And as it becomes denser, there are particular laws or dynamics that are inherent in each more or less discrete vibrational plane. They're not really separate, but there's like a rainbow, you can like touch like dead center in a particular bandwidth, and you can go, yeah, that's green, or that's pure green, that's pure red, that's pure yellow. But it is a spectrum. And each of these planes has its appertaining laws, just the way that the dynamics by which it behaves. And at a certain threshold, which the Sufis, after Ibn al-Arabi, term the barzakh, the bridge, you enter the worlds of form. And these are primarily worlds of different layers of mind. The archangelic, the various levels of the angelic, in Christian terms, the cherubim, the seraphim, and all that stuff. I mean, the Sufis have names for those too. I just don't remember what they are right now. Those don't have form. So these pictures that we see of angels having wings, and the visions that some people have had of angels, are really an impression on the mind of something that is beyond mind, beyond form, and actually beyond space and time. Or at least time as we understand it. There's time in a sense because those levels change very, very slowly compared to, Earth time. But then we come to the various levels of collective and then individual mind. And there's another breakover point where that gets dense enough that it emerges, shall we say, arises, concretizes as physical stuff, the appertaining laws being what we call Newton, the laws of physics, Newton's laws of motion, all those kinds of things are descriptions of how stuff in concrete physical reality behaves. If there's anything denser than that, I don't know what is. I don't have the capacity to perceive it. So classical yoga meditation, much of Zen and Theravada Buddhism are about retracing the arc of creation from physicality back to essence. So there's all this work done with purifying the body and working on posture and working on the mind and training the physical and mental structure so that you basically can just park it and encounter these states that in classical yoga are the various levels of samadhi. And all of that preparation is really necessary to get the body and the mind chilled out so that the meditation practice of gradually sloughing your identity of all of these accretions can take place, and pure mind can become pure spirit. And then in asamprajanata samadhi, even that goes. And you're kind of you're retracing back to the place where consciousness begins. In a sense, it would begin if it were in space and time, but it's not. But there's this ontological progression of stuff out of essence into concretization. And the vision that yoga has, and much of Zen and Theravada Buddhism, is you're just leaving this whole limitation behind. And once you reach that summit, you're done. You just have to spend more and more time there so that and get more and more facile at entering those states, so that when it comes time to, when you get the cosmic eviction notice, you can just drop the body. And it becomes, you live in that more and more, so that dropping the body, it's like nothing happens. Because your consciousness, your felt identity is so much of the boundless. And Sufis do that too. But then there's there's a bunch of things that show up as you're tracing that arc of ascent, shall we say, as though there's a place to go, which there isn't, because nothing is separate from God. You're not going anywhere. Those planes, all of them exist within us all the time. Through practice, we become more aware of them and how they are continually acting upon us. And that's really important, because that's part of the embodiment conversation. Part of what shows up as you begin this ascent is that it feels like an ascent. It's like as your awareness gets more and more refined and more nuanced, as you traverse these planes, at every level, the laws of each successive plane that you encounter become fewer. They also become more profound. And because of the nature of reality concretizing from finer vibration into grosser, the grosser levels on the ascent look illusory, until finally there's just the absolute. And from the perspective of the absolute, it's all illusion, because only the absolute truly exists from its perspective. And so you'll read these descriptions or listening to a discourse by someone who subscribes primarily to a dualistic path, is that they'll say, your ego's an illusion, you're not this body, physical reality is an illusion, anything that's not pure essence is illusory. And that's a real experience. But from the perspective of the Sufis and the Trika Shaivites and Vajrayana Buddhism, it's not complete. There's the other piece of then tracing reality from the finest essence and grossest. And a bunch of different things show up there that you don't perceive on the ascent. One of those is purpose. And so where the yogis will say existence is divine play because they haven't got a clear sense that there's a reason for any of this, on the descent, you experience the purpose of manifestation. You experience your own purpose in taking on this human incarnation, even though your identity as you experience it is provisional and only relatively real. That which we call the soul is a distinct but not separate movement of divine substance. And each soul has a unique arising, a unique trajectory through this incarnational reality, and a unique path back, as though it was ever separate, which it's not, to oneness. And if there's a goal to this practice that we, in this age we're calling Sufism, it's to be able to traverse both of those arcs and actually to live this human life as fully as possible, with as much passion and integrity and fearlessness as one can bring to it. It's in that the purpose is fulfilled. There's also individual purposes in how that unique human incarnation is most fully experienced by the work that you came here to do. And all of us have the potential to remember why we came here. And that's, so the word dhikr or zikr, depending on where you hail from. In proper Arabic, it's dhikr. The word dhikr means remembrance. That's part of the memory. And it also feels like a memory, a real thing that, we've somehow unaccountably forgotten because it's so clear. There is only one. How could I possibly have forgotten that? It's so simple and so obviously plain. And we do. Part of the purpose is in the forgetting and the remembering, and the forgetting and the remembering. And each time we remember, even if it's just the littlest bit, when we have an authentic experience of reconnecting with essence, whether it's pure essence or the different divine attributes. I'm going to use a Buddhist term here. There's merit that's gained. We develop greater capacity. Capacity for what? Capacity for fulfilling that purpose and capacity for embodying the potential that each of us has, that we came here with. So the Sufis are fond of quoting Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings. In his capacity as a wise human being and also the transmitter of profound truth, not just to his local community, but also to the whole of humanity, because that's what Rasul does. And within the structure of Islam, there's Quran, which is revealed knowledge. There's also stuff that doesn't have the status, shall we say, of scripture, but it's nonetheless God speaking. It's kind of God's editorial commentary. And then there's the laws that Muhammad gave to his assemblage, as a wise human being. And so the hadith that are considered almost scriptural, but not quite, are called hadith Qudsi. The Qudsi meaning like really holy. And so there is this hadith Qudsi, which I can't remember in Arabic just now, but it says, and it's translated a bunch of different ways, or could be translated a number of different ways, depending on your, because it's multi-layered. These things are multi-layered. And so it goes, it's God speaking. I was a hidden treasure, and I desired, longed for, had nostalgia for. There's all these different meanings packed into the word, which, my apologies, I can't remember what the word is. I longed to be known. I desired to be known. I had nostalgia to be known. So I created the worlds that I might be known. And so all of this creation is the divine experiencing its latent potential in, through, and as concrete reality. So your ego is just God's experience of multiplicity. It's not, it's like from the perspective of an embodied spiritual path, which this one is. There isn't anything that's more holy or less holy, which is a huge challenge to the Orthodox. I mean, that's like heresy. It's worse than heresy. You get your throat cut. But from the view of divine essence into this stuff, there's nothing separate from divine essence. It's just different densities of itself. And so fundamentally, there's nothing unholy about dog poop, and there's nothing more holy about spiritual practice. Having said that, they do have different purposes. And it is sometimes useful as a training of the mind and a training of the ego in order to make the ego, and this is another distinction between the kind of the paths of ascendance, ascension, what have you, transcendence, and a path of embodiment. The ego being just God's experience of multiplicity through the multiplicity of sentient beings all at once. There's a certain work, at least on this path, and this seems to be a little bit less the case with like Vajrayana or Trika Shaivism or Sri Vidya, which are two tantric paths in India that are about embodiment. The Sufi path puts a significant emphasis on the quote unquote purification of the ego, which I will explicate that in a second. And the training of the ego so that your ego being part of your interface with the rest of the world, so that that becomes a proper vehicle in the world of your spiritual realization. So, the significance of our work with the divine names. On one hand, encountering one of the divine names in its pure form can be a subject-object relationship. It's like there's times in this circle when a particular quality just shows up and it's just in the atmosphere, and pretty much everybody feels it to some degree. And there's a sense of spaciousness and fluidity and aliveness that a mere thought or imagination does not have. And it can, the experience can be everywhere from that to finding yourself, well, losing yourself, completely effaced in the quality itself. You become it, it's you. And as I said, that can be a profound, shattering experience. And so the significance of the divine names, and it doesn't matter whether there's 99 or 108 or however many, there's no canonical list. The most common list of the divine names was explicated by a guy named Al-Ghazali back in the 1400s, I think. But there's others. There's no right list. Each of the names, I don't want to call them energies because they are ontologically prior to energy. Ontology being the study of how things exist. So in movement from complete stillness into towards concretization, the divine names are formless. They are ontologically prior, most of them, to even to the angelic planes, because the angels have attributes. And these names, as we call them, are self-subsisting. They don't depend on anything for their existence or their movement. And again, like pure essence, they are only truly known by means of themselves. And they can be encountered, and one can get a felt experience of the particular quality, direction, perfume, nature. And this can be very sensate. It's not abstract. And they form the seeds of what if they existed fully in a human being would exist as a completely conscious, fully developed, fully mature human personality. And that's not any of us. The work with them, however, the seeds of all of the names exist within us, within the subtle structure of the human being. They're implicit. For most of us, in our development as a person, there's certain of these names that tend to concretize through the personality and emerge as qualities at particular developmental stages of, psychophysical, psychosocial, psychospiritual. These things track in a certain way along with our physical, mental, emotional growth as human beings. And to really develop in us, these emergences need to be mirrored in a certain way by the adults around us, our caregivers, parents, what have you. And if that mirroring is sufficient, then there develops an accommodation in the personality for this continually concretizing energy. It's like the soul coming on earth, quote unquote, which is a very Christian phraseology. is not just historical. That movement of our being from pure essence into concretization is happening all the time, not just every breath, but every instant. We are continually recreated, concretized all the time. And as we begin to awaken to how all of this actually works, we begin to experience that as a direct sensate experience. And then life gets really interesting. There's no boredom, because it's all just this exquisite, delicate, powerful, beautiful unfolding. And working with the names, in a sense, awakens sometimes that seed that exists in each one of us of that energy, that quality, that particular direction of being, that movement. And it widens the aperture so that this continual movement of life, the names are tremendously alive. They're not just alive, they are life in all of those different countenances. So we widen the aperture. We also widen it in both directions so that it begins to, the power, the beingness of this name begins to inform our personality and our felt identity more and more. And the contrivances that we've put in place to try to be that energy that was not encouraged, not seen, not properly mirrored in us, those contrivances tend to melt away from us little by little. And so when we talk about purifying the ego, that's what that means. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, on this path, we're not trying to kill the ego, because the ego is just a point of view. When awakening begins to take us over, the personal ego is not killed. It doesn't die. It doesn't go anywhere, but it is decentralized. So it's still there, and you can still be just as quirky as you want, according, and just a lot of that becomes kind of an aesthetic choice rather than something that you are compelled to be. So Anaya Khan wrote this. Well, he didn't write the book, The Art of Personality. But it was a large topic compiled from his discourses called The Art of Personality. And it's well worth reading. And the only proviso that I would offer in that regard is it's not Sufi charm school. It's a path to authenticity, because otherwise there's no point. There is literally no point. And yeah, you may be awakened or enlightened after you've got the cosmic eviction notice. Who knows? Um, I'm not awake enough to know really the nature of what kind of awakening process happens with people who don't awaken in life. Um, I don't have to know because I'm not interested in waiting. So, so the zikr is about emptiness. The turn is about emptiness so that we can be filled properly, choicelessly, because we don't have any idea, most of us, what the original intention was in taking this human incarnation. And that may change. And so our task is to empty ourselves of ourselves, not necessarily all at once, but little by little, as we can do that and not go crazy or totally trash our lives beyond recoverability. But if that's going to be your your dharma, then you don't have a choice about it. For some people, it's their way. You know, I'm not big on pushing for breakthroughs because they often can't be maintained and they leave a mess. And it's sometimes a lot of work to clean up after a breakthrough that is unsustainable. So don't do that if you can avoid it. It may seem to be really exciting and people have written books about their explosive openings. Um, you will not handle it smoothly. Because whatever breaks is like the weakest link, and there's usually a whole bunch of unconsciousness around and defensive structure around that. And when that collapses, um, it can be really difficult. So that's my riff. And if I think of anything else to say, I'll say it next week. So do your practices, ask the questions, read the teachings if you feel the need to. At some point, when the book of your own heart opens up, that's all you need. But that's not the beginning of the path or the middle. And be grateful for this opportunity to become fully human, because most of us aren't. But we have the opportunity, and that's such a huge blessing. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Karamaz ismi Muhyiddin Hisar az Dardar Devjin Shayatin Alins Mar. Yaftam Rakul bi Hal Rauf Al Abam Shahi Mardan Zul Jalal. Karadamaz ismi Muhyiddin Hisar az Dardar Devjin Shayatin Alins Mar. Yaftam Rakul bi Hal Rauf Al Abam Shahi Mardan Zul Jalal. Karamaz ismi Muhyiddin Hisar az Dardar Devjin Shayatin Alins Mar. Yahtam Dakur bi Hal Rauf al Adam Shahi Mardan Zul Jalal. Ya Allah.